Hey, listeners, just a programming note before we begin. This podcast that you're about to hear, we recorded on Wednesday in response to the upset in New York's 14th Congressional District. But while I was in the process of editing this podcast, the news broke that Justice Kennedy is retiring from the Supreme Court. So we recorded another emergency podcast and put that out on Wednesday instead. And if you're looking for a response to Kennedy's retirement, you can find that just below this podcast in the feed. But even though this is now a day old, we still wanted to put this out there so you could listen to what we had to say about what happened on Tuesday night. Hello and welcome to the 538 Politics Podcast, Election Reaction Edition. I'm Galen Druk. Folks, we got the upset of the primary season Tuesday night, at least the upset of the season for now. It happened in New York's 14th Congressional District. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a 28-year-old Democratic socialist, beat Joseph Crowley, a 10-term incumbent and number 4 Democrat in the House. And it wasn't the only win for the progressive wing of the party. Ben Jealous, who was endorsed by Bernie Sanders, also won the nomination for Maryland governor. So many takes to sort through. It's almost like people want to make generalizations using limited evidence. So, of course, to break it down for us, here with me are senior politics writer Claire Malone. Hey, Claire.
Hey, Galen.
How's it going?
Good.
And politics editor Micah Cohen. Hey, Micah.
What's up, everybody? Glad to be back. I haven't been on the show in a while.
I know. Good to have you here. Okay, so let's just get some reactions out of the gate. Claire, what's on your mind?
Well, I thought the race of the night last night was going to be the Maryland gubernatorial primary, which Ben Jealous did win. Because to me, that was like, okay, that's the interesting, if we're looking with an eye towards 2020 and what is the new litmus test for the Democrats. The fact that Ben Jealous was pushing some really progressive policies, I was like, great, that's the one that's going to be the interesting one. Well, as it turns out, I was sure wrong, because
half wrong. That was still a big race.
Yeah, that was a statewide race.
It was a big race, but this race in the 14th district really just kind of snuck up out of nowhere to be the big story of the night. I mean, I think I first saw former podcast member Harry Enton tweet out some pretty surprising minute-by-minute results, or where the results were at a certain point in the night, and it was pretty shocking. And I think what's most interesting to me, as a New York resident, democratic socialism has become a little bit of like an in vogue thing, I think, in city politics, and you'll hear people talking about it a lot. So it's really striking to me to see Ocasio-Cortez, who is a member of the DSA, win this contest by really kind of just like legging it out. She was a Bernie Sanders organizer, we should mention. So pretty crazy. And she would be the youngest member in the House.
In case anybody missed it, Micah, can you catch us up to speed on, what exactly happened? What were the final results? What was the campaign like? If there were particular issues that stuck out?
Yeah, I learned all, I'm going to answer that question, but I will admit that I learned all this morning, in the sense of this is not a campaign I had been following, to Claire's point. It wasn't sort of it was on the peripheral of the radar. I will say, shout out to Nathaniel Rakich, 538 writer. In his preview of the race, he had this race listed as a race where Democratic incumbents could get a scare. So the final result was, it was 58-42, I think.
Yeah, so not even that close.
So not only did she win, but she kind of blew Crowley out. She had been campaigning on Medicare for all, criminal justice reform, getting rid of ICE, guaranteeing federal jobs. These are hardcore liberal positions. I mean, this is like, I'm trying to think of a good example of like a solidly liberal candidate. I mean, Crowley was a solidly liberal guy. We can talk about some of the other stuff about him that maybe hurt him here, but nobody was saying he wasn't progressive, right? But she is several steps to the left of that.
You might even say a different party.
You might even say, yes, you might. So the big question for me is like, is that why she won? Or is this more about identity and the establishment? In other words, she looks much more like this district, which has grown much more diverse.
Crowley is white.
Crowley is white. I think Irish American. This district has grown much more diverse. Crowley is the establishment. He is progressive, but he has ties to Wall Street, right? That's part of why he was able to raise so much more money than her. So I think what's causing problems with like the next day takes on this race, nobody should be debating that this is a big result. It's a very big result. It's unexpected. It's the number 4 Democrat in the House. A person of that stature losing is a big deal. I think that people are getting into trouble when they try to ascribe why he lost, right? And my sense is people are going to say, oh, it's because he wasn't progressive enough, or, oh, it was because he's a white man, or, oh, it's because he was too establishment-y, when the right answer is probably
a combination.
Yeah, a combination of all of them, I guess. Or, I don't know, do you guys think one of those had outsized sway on this result?
Probably the identity.
The identity stuff.
Yeah. I think tied up with the identity stuff is also that, you know, we talk a lot about, well, what is the real difference between quote unquote a progressive and quote unquote establishment?
Right.
If Joe Crowley was already pretty liberal in his positions, a lot of it just has to do with what's your public posture as a candidate. Are you more baiting of ICE, for instance, as she was? Are you more of like running more of a rabble-rousing campaign as she was, right? While also it being a very media-savvy campaign in some ways, I think. Last night on Twitter, tons of people were passing around her kind of campaign bio video, which was very like 2018, a good gauzy campaign bio ad. So I think a lot of it is just like the way that you present yourself in public seems to matter quite a bit in 2018 because you have a lot of Democratic voters who are ticked off at the government and want that expressed by their candidates.
And we should also mention that this is a really Democratic district. It voted for Hillary Clinton by 60 points, and that was not unique. It had voted for Obama by the same margin. You talked about identity. Of course, she's Latina, and we also talked about the platform that she ran on. But is this also unique to this kind of district? This is not every district in America, and this is also not the kind of district that Democrats need to win to take back the House, for example. So what do we make of where this happened?
This is a solidly blue district, and therefore she is very likely to win in November unless something goes terribly awry, right? And so I think, you know, you saw a lot of chatter last night about, are we seeing a liberal Tea Party? Are we seeing a liberal Tea Party? But if Democrats are lurching left in districts like this, I'm not sure you qualify that as a Tea Party in the sense that, like, I think when people say Tea Party, they mean nominating extreme candidates in districts and states that are closer to the center and therefore throwing away winnable races, right? This is not that. This is, hey, it's a really blue district. Let's have a really blue representative.
I mean, everyone kept on bringing up, because Crowley is part of the Democratic leadership, everyone kept on bringing up Eric Cantor's loss to David Brat, who would become a member of the Freedom Caucus in the House, you know, a very, very Tea Party-ish candidate who, you know, I guess his last name sort of speaks to, he had a little bit of a bratty sense of like, all right.
Yeah, going for it.
He's not a
screw the leadership. He's not.
Get along to go along guy.
Correct.
Go along to get along.
Right.
Okay, so to place a kind of like benchmark right here, on a scale from 0 to 2010 Tea Party, where would you place where the Democrats are right now in the 2018 cycle?
I don't know what I still don't know what the Tea Party thing means, because the Tea Party movement was also like kind of a sustained organizing movement within those districts. Are we talking about that vis-a-vis what the general election and mobilized turnout will be? Are we? Oh, Micah looks like he has a.
I got an idea.
You got an idea. Okay.
All right. So we're going to have two definitions of Tea Party: Tea Party A and Tea Party B. Tea Party A is a rush of excitement in the base of a party among its most ideological members, where they're organizing, they're coming out to vote, they're getting on ballots, and thus pushing their party closer to the ideological pole, right? So for Republicans in 2010, that was to the right. For Democrats in 2018, that would be to the left. I think in that sense, are we seeing a Tea Party? I'd say probably, I'd put, you know, on a scale of 0 to 2010 Tea Party, I'd say 7 or 8, something like that. I think we are seeing that. Tea Party B, though, has a much more anti-establishment of the party flair. In other words, in 2010 and to a much lesser extent in 2014, you didn't just see grassroots organizers and Tea Party organizers pushing for more conservative candidates. You saw them explicitly targeting pretty conservative incumbents. There was a huge kind of anti-party establishment feeling to that movement.
Mm-hmm.
And on that dimension, I don't think we're seeing real evidence of that yet. We may, but we're not seeing real evidence of that yet. This isn't a perfect measure of it, but the DCCC, which is the establishment, they are 20-2 in races that they've invested in so far.
So they got 20 of the people that they endorsed won, 2 of the people that they endorsed lost.
Right. That does not speak to a sort of anti-establishment wave, as far as I can tell. So,
yeah, I mean, this is maybe a more interesting, bigger, broader discussion of like, why does a movement like the Tea Party that is super anti-establishment flourish in the conservative ideology, conservative end of things, and why do people on the left remain more wedded to their party institutions maybe, or their party establishment?
But I mean, if you look at the actual numbers in 2010, not that many incumbents lost in the primary, right?
What were the numbers?
It was something like 3 Republicans lost in the House, 2 in the Senate, and one of them was Lisa Murkowski, who ended up winning in the general election. Like, is the standard kind of how many people lose in primaries? Or should we also be thinking of like who's winning in open seats or something like that?
Yeah, I would treat those separately, I think. I mean, it goes back to my Tea Party A and Tea Party B. The former, how many incumbents are losing, I think that's how much of an anti-establishment reckoning is there. I think you saw that with Cantor, right? The latter, in like open seat races, I think that's just, the Republican Party was moving to the right. That was catalyzed by Obama. And I think we're seeing the same thing with Democrats. They're moving to the left. Now, to Claire's question of why we're not seeing a similar anti-establishment push on the left.
I mean, we are to a certain extent, I want to be clear, but it's probably something where it's like part of conservative core ideological values are more of a break from government, more of a focus on individual rights and individual power, whereas Democrats do inherently in their ideological values put value on cooperation, building institutions in government, building structures within government to help things. And maybe there's just more of a party emphasis on, okay, we got to have someone on the inside who like already understands it. There has to be institutional knowledge of how this government system works. I don't know. That's just me spitballing.
No, I think that's right. I think there is a cultural element to it. I also think like Democrats, the nature of their coalition is different than Republicans, where Democrats, it is much more of a coalition of groups.
Right. Republicans they're much more, we've talked about this, they're much more of like an out group in American society, like, or a shrinking group demographically by race and age. No,
and so the stance of being on the outside throwing stones comes very naturally to Republicans. I don't mean that in a pejorative way. It's like, while for Democrats, they're the pro-government party, which in some sense means being pro-establishment, compromise, as you said, Claire.
So Theda Skopal. God, I'm sorry. I should be better at pronouncing her name. But she did a large academic study of the Tea Party a few years ago, and she has done some work on sort of tracking the indivisible type movement on the left. And this is, I'm quoting from an Economist piece in February of this year. It basically says, talking about the sort of left activists, it says, Ms. Skopal and Ms. Putnam find the new activists are a rather moderate bunch, that they're disproportionately female, about 70% are women of these local indivisible things. They say, this will not look like a far-left reinvention of Tea Partiers or a continuation of Bernie 2016. It will look like retired librarians rolling their eyes at the present state of affairs and then taking charge, which I thought was an interesting...
And to me, that's the takeaway from the Crawley loss is, and we've seen evidence of this elsewhere, but I think you're seeing, it's not only the year of the woman, right? Is it the Year of the Woman or Year of Women?
The Year of the Woman, I guess.
That's not a good name. We need a better name for that. As a man, in my opinion. But to me, the takeaway is, and it goes back to what Claire said at the top of the show, about identity and the Democratic Party beginning to look much, much more, or at the early stages of looking much, much more like its voters, which is non-white, not all men, LGBT, all across the board, I think you're seeing these candidates do well. And I would, going into 2020, I would expect, all else being equal, which often is not, but all else being equal, I think it's can you imagine this Democratic Party nominating Joe Biden? This party that just got rid of Crowley to then turn around and nominate Joe Biden? Claire's shaking her head and mouthing, no.
I mean, the thing that's interesting, right, is that
I was embellishing a little bit.
I mean, Ocasio-Cortez kind of ran on the platform of Bernie Sanders, but she's also a young woman of color, right?
That's a big difference.
Yeah, Sanders' coalition was whiter than Clinton's coalition.
Sanders changed the Democratic Party. I feel pretty confident in saying that. I think Sanders' race changed the rules of the game for what the 2020 primary will be. I think you're seeing people who are probably going to run for office taking much more liberal positions.
Yeah.
I think you're seeing people just on a pure sort of like example basis running for offices that they might not have considered running for, or people who might have in previous years or under Obama's or in Obama's tenure, maybe they would have been a certain kind of activist, or they would have, whatever it is, they're running for more mainstream offices. I think Sanders' candidacy really did do quite a bit to reshape things. And even if he doesn't run for president, I do think he still holds kind of a little bit of like a, benighting influence on.
Ooh, you kind of lost me there. I agree. I agree that I'd call it.
You don't think his endorsement would mean anything for or him campaigning with someone else?
No, it would. You're right. I guess I'd say I think it will mean less than I would have predicted after 2016.
But it'll still mean something.
It'll still mean something. And, I think you're right that he has had an effect on the Democratic Party. I also think, though, that it's like part him having an effect and part he was just emblematic of trends that were already happening. But if you take the enthusiasm that drove Sanders in 2016 and you make it a less white coalition, that is super powerful going into 2020. And if I were running in the Democratic primary, that would be a position that I would love to be in.
And that's to some degree what we saw in New York's 14th congressional district last night.
I think that's right. So what's the way to sum this up? It's like it is a confluence of factors that led to this. Each of them on their own are not determinative. In other words, if we have another race with an incumbent Democrat who is, let's say, a white man running against an insurgent candidate who, let's say, a Latino, is a black woman, or that on its own is not enough where I think people should not take away from New York 14, oh, well, that white man is in trouble. But if you have that plus, he was kind of taking the race for granted, plus she was to the left of him, plus all these other factors, then together that can make a big difference. But like each thing on its own, the anti-incumbency, the identity, those things on their own aren't necessarily enough to like throw a race one way or the other. It's really together that they work.
So we've thrown this forward a bit to 2020, but before we wrap up, I mean, does this make you update your priors at all for 2018?
I'm trying to think about what priors I would update because of last night.
Okay, so my priors heading into last night were the Democratic Party as represented by who it's nominating and who it's represented by is becoming more diverse along race, gender, and other lines. I am more confident in that coming out of last night.
Although I would say we already kind of knew that. Like, last night didn't change anything?
No, last night didn't change anything. And actually, open primaries that pitted at least one woman against one man, I think women actually didn't do as well last night as they have in primary nights previously this year. But still, I think that's a trend. My prior is the Democratic Party will take some number of steps to the left in the 2018 midterms. I think that's still true. To me, the big question mark is how much of an anti-incumbency, anti-establishment tenor will there be to the Democratic enthusiasm in 2018? And I don't think the Crowley loss on its own is enough that we should update that prior that much.
Yeah, I would say that you are right that it strengthened the first one you mentioned, which is like things getting more diverse.
Yeah.
I keep on going back to like, it was a night for New York. I keep on thinking about the Nixon-Cuomo race, the gubernatorial primary.
Right.
I mean, she's not doing
great.
Yeah. And so, like that's
it's a counterexample.
That's a counterexample.
Yeah.
So it's like, so the establishment still does have power. So to your second point of how anti-establishment will the 2018 wave be, I don't know.
No, that's where I am too. And the Cantor example is actually a good one because 2010 was the year where Republicans did sort of cut off their nose to spite their face in a few races where they ousted a few high-profile incumbent Republicans in favor of kind of more outsidery, more extreme nominees, right? 2014, they did a much better job of renominating their incumbents and a much better job of nominating in open races what you would call safer, more establishment-y candidates. And that was after the Cantor defeat. So in that sense, I do think it's a useful precedent where it's perfectly normal to have races like New York 14, but then for the overall landscape to be like, oh, yeah, it wasn't that anti-establishment-y.
Yeah, and I think, going into last night, the New York Times had just published an article looking at the success of Bernie Sanders' group, Our Revolution, and it found that the candidates that they nominated were successful in fewer than 50% of the more than 80 races where they endorsed. So Cynthia Nixon example is...
Yeah, although I will say, I think that the Sanders influence goes beyond Our Revolution, which seems to be an organization that has some internal issues. So I think Seth brought that up to my point last night when I said this is actually a pretty big night for the Sanders wing of Democratic politics, and Seth said, well, not a lot of the Our Revolution endorsed candidates did well. Fair. But I also think that his influence has spread beyond just who they endorse specifically.
No, that's right.
Because Sanders didn't endorse Ocasio-Cortez.
I totally agree with that. But I guess it is a useful indicator
metric
to me that this isn't necessarily about ideology on its own or insider outsiderness on its own. Again, it's a confluence of factors. And if I had to rank them, which I don't, but I will, I think I would just put identity and energy at the top of that list,
All right. Well, we'll see where things go from here. In the meantime, Claire, thanks for being here today.
Thanks, Galen.
Thank you, Micah.
My pleasure, as always. I hope to be back soon.
Well, you're off next week, unfortunately.
I'm off for 2 weeks.
Soon enough.
Going to the beach.
All right, that's it. I'm Galen Druk. Thanks for joining us for this primary reaction edition of the podcast. Have a great weekend, and we will be back on Monday.